Imagine looking down at a concrete floor inside a massive dark room to see a single, colorful piece of trash. That small wrapper left behind in Port Chester, New York, represents the brutal execution of the American dream. The machines were still warm, and the smell of sugar and mint still hung heavily in the air. Outside, 1,100 workers were trying to figure out what had just happened to their lives. At its peak, this specific factory was one of the most productive candy operations in the entire world. This single facility turned out millions of rolls every single day. Those iconic foil-wrapped cylinders had become so embedded in American culture that they were no longer just candy. They were a cultural reference point. You bought them at every checkout counter in America for the exact price printed right there on the wrapper. It was still only 5 cents. By the 1980s, Lifesavers commanded roughly 25% of the American roll candy market. They had essentially invented and dominated this category for 7 entire decades. Then Kraft bought the brand, crunched the corporate numbers, and decided that making candy in New York was exactly 90 cents more expensive per 1,000 units than making it in Ontario, Canada. 90 cents per 1,000 units. That is the terrifying arithmetic that ended a century of American candy making in Westchester County. Within 18 months of that announcement, the Port Chester plant was completely silent. The equipment was loaded onto trucks and driven across the border. The massive building sat empty for years before developers finally converted it into luxury condominiums. The workers whose families had worked those lines for 3 generations scattered into an economy that had no particular interest in their specific skills. This is the tragic story of how a 5-cent candy built an empire, defined an era, and then disappeared from its hometown. Keep listening, because the exact reason this empire fell will completely change how you look at the candy aisle forever. The Lifesavers story begins not with a sprawling factory, but with a frustrating problem that a chocolate salesman named Clarence Crane was trying to solve in the hot summer of 1912. Crane was selling chocolate under his own brand and doing reasonably well. But chocolate had a fatal weakness that Crane understood better than most of his wealthy competitors. It melted easily. Every summer, his sales collapsed entirely. Retailers did not want to stock product that would turn into a brown puddle by July. Customers did not want to buy candy that arrived at their destination as a warm smear. Crane desperately needed something he could sell year-round. He needed something that would not melt and could sit on a store counter in August, looking exactly the same as it did in January. The brilliant solution he finally came up with was almost entirely accidental. Crane decided to make a hard, non-melting mint candy. The British had been making hard mints for centuries, but to create a shape that was completely new, he chose a ring with a hole right in the middle. He had the candies pressed by a pill-making machine, which is exactly why the famous hole exists. It was industrial improvisation using medical equipment that was locally available. He named them Lifesavers for their resemblance to the ring-shaped flotation devices that were standard equipment on any seagoing vessel. He packaged them in cardboard tubes and began selling them to drugstores in the Cleveland area at an asking price of 5 cents a roll. What happened next is where the story gets truly fascinating. Crane, having invented what would soon become one of the most successful candy products in American history, promptly decided he did not want to be in the hard candy business at all. He was a dedicated chocolate man. In 1913, less than a year after introducing his creation to the market, he sold the Lifesavers brand to a New York advertising man named Edward Noble for just $1,500. Edward Noble was not a candy maker. He was primarily an advertising salesman, a man who deeply understood how products reached consumers. He had just purchased a brand that came with one serious operational problem. The candy was terrible. The recipe was fine, but the packaging was fundamentally flawed. Crane had been selling Lifesavers wrapped in cardboard, and the cardboard gave the candy a distinctly cardboard flavor. Noble understood immediately that he had bought a major packaging problem. His first critical decision was to switch to foil wrapping. Foil preserved the flavor, protected the candy from moisture, and crucially gave the product a premium visual identity. A roll of Lifesavers in foil wrapping caught the light at the point of sale and felt solid and serious in your hand. Noble made his second crucial decision soon after that. He went to drugstores and tobacco shops and made them a very specific offer. Put Lifesavers next to the cash register and make sure every customer leaving with a purchase received change that included a nickel. Noble understood human psychology perfectly. If the nickel is in someone's hand and there is a 5-cent candy right in front of them, the candy has a reasonable chance. If the nickel is in their pocket, the candy has no chance at all. It worked perfectly. What Noble understood was that Lifesavers was not competing against other candies. It was competing for the loose change moment. By 1920, Lifesavers was operating out of a massive facility in Port Chester, New York, a manufacturing town on the Long Island Sound. The factory on Westchester Avenue would become the beating center of the company universe for the next 8 decades. Port Chester was a proud working-class town. The immigrant communities that built the workforce were predominantly Italian and Eastern European, and they took serious pride in doing their jobs well. When Lifesavers moved its main production to Port Chester, it entered this existing culture and became an integral part of it. By the 1930s, fruit flavors were arriving, including cherry, orange, lemon, lime, and eventually pineapple. The 5-flavor roll launched in 1935 and became one of the most successful individual candy products of the entire century. The Second World War completely transformed the American candy industry. Sugar rationing, introduced in 1942, restricted production across the board. Lifesavers managed this period better than most because it was incredibly cheap. At 5 cents a roll, it sat at a price point that even wartime consumers could easily access. Lifesavers were included in military ration kits throughout the war. Kraft acquired the Lifesavers brand in 1988 for approximately $750 million. Kraft brought highly sophisticated cost analysis to the operation. When they turned those ruthless capabilities on the Port Chester facility, the results were brutally clear. Production in Ontario, Canada, where labor costs were lower, would reduce manufacturing costs by exactly 90 cents per 1,000 units. That difference translated to millions annually. In 1988, Kraft announced it would close Port Chester. Production wound down over 18 painful months. You train your replacements, in a sense. You watch the equipment get prepared for disassembly. The closure in 1989 removed the economic center of gravity from a community that had organized itself around that factory for 70 years. The direct impact was 1,100 lost jobs, but the multiplier effect devastated local businesses. The candy made in Ontario was exactly the same, but the Lifesavers made in Port Chester was the output of a community and families who spent generations learning to make a thing well. The Port Chester factory was rationalized out of existence by 90 cents per thousand units. When Kraft paid millions for the brand, they paid for the consumer recognition. They did not pay for the Port Chester factory or the community relationships. In the corporate calculus, those things were strictly costs. The wrapper on the floor when they turned off the lights in 1989 was not just a piece of candy packaging. It was the last physical artifact of a relationship between a company and a community that lasted 70 beautiful years. The ordinary math of corporate decision-making, applied without malice, destroyed everything for the people it affected. That is the real tragedy.